Okay, I have two things that I want to announce. The first is that this Thursday, as some of you may know, there's a rally at Sproul Plaza about the cuts to public education, and in the case of the UCs and CSUs, the raise in tuition fees. And there's a Regents meeting coming up where one proposal is to increase fees another 81% over 4 years. So there's obviously going to be a fair amount of mobilization on campus this semester. I think there are two big events planned for the beginning of November. I'm very passionately care about trying to save public education, not just at the UCs, but in our public schools as well. And so I will be ending the class on Thursday early to be able to attend and participate in the rally. I've sent you all an email notice about it. But I promise you that I will get through the class material before leaving on Thursday, so you won't miss a cent of your very increasingly expensive education. But I think that this is an important time for this issue. So if things happen later, in the semester, that's a conversation that we may have collectively as a group. That meeting is being prepared for by that rally is being prepared for by a meeting actually in this room, I think, at 6 o'clock this evening, if any of you are interested in attending. Okay. Does anyone have any administrative announcements, issues? No? Everyone's feeling like happy campers this week? Great. So this week I'm giving you two lectures that are that in a way represent the first turning point in the class, thematically and chronologically. Today's lecture is going to be, in a way, a continuation of the last series of lectures that I've done that have been looking at different aspects of what I have called liberalism's rule of difference. That is to say that the tension between the universal claims of liberalism to include everybody and to offer liberty and freedom for everyone, with the singling out of particular groups as different and as not yet quite ready or able to have the liberties of self-government. So today I'm doing that obviously in the context of the position of women in the second half of the 19th century. On Thursday, I'm going to do a lecture which is basically about the first global financial crisis in the 1870s and the Great Depression that followed, and the way in which that led to a series of new challenges in a new set of economic and social problems that led to a quite different orientation in the final decades of the century. So think of this lecture as, the last of a series of three, and the next lecture as beginning basically the run-up to the mayhem of the late 19th and early 20th century, with all the war and, colonial expansion and mass violence, and lots of other good stuff too, I promise. So traditionally, I never did this lecture. Last year, I wrote this lecture partly because I'd been shamed by a series of GSIs that I never did a separate lecture on the position of women. And my argument was always, well, I don't need to do that because, I really like to talk about how the experience of women in every lecture that I give, and I really consider that gender is a structuring form of power throughout the 19th century. But the reality is, as my GSIs frequently reminded me, that was simply a sort of cover for a very obvious absence in these lectures. So last year, or actually 2 years ago, I sat down and said, okay, come in clean, and I'm going to do this lecture. So this is the product of a fair amount of shame and embarrassment. Let me give you a brief outline of then the sort of context in which women's history, gender history, and sort of feminist scholarship produced the version of this story that produced. From the 1970s, when you have really the first articulation of a clear feminist history, there was a very straightforward narrative of the position of women in Britain. And it went like this, that partly as a consequence of the Enlightenment, partly as a consequence of capitalism and the Industrial Revolution, partly as a consequence of the growth of the evangelical movement, you have a consolidation of an ideology of separate spheres, of the separation of men and women into separate spheres of action. This ideology of separate spheres then became the main target for the organization of feminist politics in the 19th century. So feminist politics emerges as a critique of this ideology of separate spheres. And it culminates, of course, in Britain with the achievement of full political equality in 1928. But as you're going to see today, there's lots of other things along the way. What happens then, and this is to push the story forward into the 20th century that I'll pick up later in the semester, is that formal political equality obscured the continuing subordination of women, particularly in this sort of organization of the welfare state, and really the establishment of the welfare state in the 1940s. And it was that subordination which basically continued to prioritize women's role in the home that the feminist movement of the late 1960s and early 1970s came to challenge. Now, as you're going to be able to tell, most of my lecture conforms quite neatly to that to that tradition of scholarship. But I'm going to give it my own special twist, which is to say that one of the things that I want to use this story as doing today is being able to show how the position of women in Victorian society pushed up against and exposed the contradictions within liberalism itself, and the central contradiction of the universal promise that everyone is going to have liberty with the identification of those particular groups who weren't really yet able to experience it. I'm also going to emphasize that the ideology of separate spheres was something that was really an ideal rather than something that was clearly established. And that was particularly true the further down the social scale that you went. Okay? So not surprisingly, most... no, actually, I'm not going to go there. That will get me in even more trouble. Okay, let's move on. So let me start by talking about separate spheres first. So this ideology of separate spheres, what is it? Well, very simply, it's the idea that you have two discrete spheres, a public realm of action, public political realm of action, which is where men are going to reside and participate, and a private domain, which was at the preserve of women. And the argument was that essentially women had to be excluded from that public domain of politics and of business because of their close connection to the biological rhythms of their own body. That is to say that women were basically considered incapable of rational thought and deliberation because they were too close to nature. That the experience of menstruation, of child rearing, of childbirth, made women basically irrational or incapable of independence and rational thought. So men then get associated with culture and rationality, and women get associated with nature and biology. Now, the twist side of that, because any act of subordination is basically predicated on a promise that you're going to get something out of it, so the twist was that even though that women were considered to be captives of their own biology, that enabled them to be free of all the corruptions of the public world of politics and business. That is to say that they had the enormous privilege of being able to stay in the sort of morally pure zone that was the private domain. And their job was obviously to raise children and to help their men who had this hardship of being out in the public world, to help their men recuperate from those travails when they returned from work. Now, there's an enormous amount of debate across any number of disciplines and any numbers of historical fields about when this ideology of separate spheres developed. Okay? Many people have argued that it had been around basically for centuries. Okay? Some people associate it with the Reformation in Europe. Other people want to try and make an argument that there's something very new and distinct about the late 18th and early 19th century articulation of separate spheres, which they want to link both to the development of industrial capitalism and the reorganization of the division between work and home, and to the traditions of Enlightenment thought, which of course put so much weight upon the rational pursuit of knowledge. The point that I want to make here, and it's one that you're going to see consistently develop through the lecture, is that this ideology of separate spheres was never really achieved. It was an aspiration rather than a reality. And yet, I want to make the point straight away that even those people who, even lower down the social scale, as it were, people are participating in the promotion of this ideology. Okay? So let me give you two examples about that. I don't want you to think of this as simply as it often is presented, as a type of middle class ideal. Okay? That only the middle classes get to enjoy the world of the division of the world into these separate spheres, because the Chartists and the labour movement also believe very strongly in this separation of spheres and used it to advance their own claims. So Chartist men made the argument that they had to have the vote to ensure that they could protect and support the women and children at home. So Chartist men use it as a way of advancing their own political claims above and beyond those of women.